Hey kiddies, today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the brain. The brain is an amazing organ and it's actually, I'm going to give you a few facts on it. It actually contains about 100 billion neurons, monitors and regulates most of the conditions in your body. It weighs about 1.5 kilograms, which is roughly about 1.5 kilograms of sugar. It's protected by a fluid-filled gap, and it contains about, well, it's made up of about 75% water, which, considering that it's the main organ that enables us to think, is pretty amazing. If you were to get both your fists and put them together, that would be about the size of your brain. Now, our brains are obviously a lot smaller than an elephant's, but really interestingly, during fetus, the human brain grows at around, during pregnancy rather, the fetus's brain grows at a rate of about 250 neurons per minute. If we don't have any oxygen to the brain, after about 8 to 10 seconds we will lose consciousness, and there are no pain receptors in the brain. So if I were to crack your skull open, which I wouldn't, but if I were to do that, that would hurt a lot, but once you got past that, once I actually started poking your brain, that wouldn't hurt at all. So what makes up the brain? The brain is actually comprised of 3 different areas. You have your hindbrain here, which is probably the most primitive part of the brain. It is what controls our breathing, our heart rate. It basically keeps us alive. The midbrain is actually a much smaller part of the brain, and it's what links the hind and the forebrain, and it contains the reticular activating system. This is really important, especially when talking about levels of arousal, our attention, and our consciousness. The forebrain is probably the most recent development in terms of evolution. It's involved in higher order thinking. So it contains our thalamus, the hypothalamus, the cerebrum, and also the limbic system. And we're going to be looking at the amygdala and the hippocampus as later on in the unit. We'll also be looking at the corpus callosum and the 4 lobes of the brain. Lobes, not loaves, lobes. This is another diagram of the brain. As you can see, it actually shows you the green area is the limbic system and the yellow is the cerebral cortex. But this entire region here is the forebrain. Okay, so the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the outer folded layer of the cerebral hemispheres. It is about 2 to 3 millimeters thick, and if you would actually fold it out, it would be about 2 A3 pieces of paper. The way they cram it into, well, when I say they, you know what I mean. The way that it gets crammed into your brain is because it's all folded in on itself. It does contain about 3/4 of the neurons in the brain, and as I mentioned before, it's involved with these higher order thinking, things like perception, language, our ability to learn, our ability to problem solve, to organize things, and it controls our voluntary movement as well. Within the cerebral cortex, we have something called lateralization of function, and this is basically the idea that different parts of the cerebral cortex are dedicated to different specific functions. So for example, if I ask you to visualize somebody on a motorbike, you'd be using a specific part in your visual cortex to do this. That's not to say that other parts of the brain aren't helping or aren't working at the same time, but generally speaking, there's that specific area that's helping you to visualize. Here's a couple of diagrams comparing a human, monkey and a mouse brain. You'll notice that the amount of cerebral cortex, that outer folded layer, is significantly reduced as we move down to lower order mammals. So the cerebral cortex is actually organized in 3 main categories. The first is the primary cortices, or 2 main categories, primary cortexes. You have the sensory cortexes and the motor cortexes. Now the sensory cortexes include your primary auditory cortex, your primary visual, and your primary somatosensory. And generally speaking, what will happen is that information will come from the senses to each of these different cortices, and then they will be moved on to the association areas for further processing. You'll notice that the primary auditory cortex is located very close to the association cortex. So this is where so that the information that's coming in from the auditory senses can then be processed really quickly. The sensory information doesn't go straight to the auditory cortex. It actually has to bypass what's called the thalamus, and the thalamus will actually direct it to the right part of the brain. Please click on the next video and have a watch of this because I'm running out of time.